If you voted last November, you may remember flipping over to the backside of your ballot and voting yes or no on the Environmental Bond Act. About 60% of New Yorkers voted yes, and that gave New York permission to borrow more than $4 billion to spend on climate mitigation and the environment. It's your/taxpayers' money, so it's time now for you to weigh in on how we spend that money. That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Claxton Hepburn Medical Center, dedicated to providing patient care and regional services to the people of St. Lawrence County. claxtonhepburn.org.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Thursday, August 10th. First up, Lewis County has declared a state of emergency after widespread flooding and a tornado earlier this week. The National Weather Service says 3 to 4 inches of rain fell since Monday's storm. 7 rural roads are closed due to the flooding, mostly in the southern half of the county. The National Weather Service in Buffalo confirmed the tornado that touched down Monday night was an EF3. That category means strong and is right below a violent EF4 or 5, the highest category. Catherine Wheeler reports.
The tornado started at 7:42 on Monday evening in the southern part of the town of Lewis. It spun for 16 miles and had a width of 700 yards. It ended in the town of Turin at 8:14. National Weather Service meteorologist Liz Jerkowski says winds peaked at 140 miles per hour.
There's a lot of trees that were broken throughout. We've seen places where there's damage to 2 homes, where a roof was uplifted off of the home, or a wall blown out of a garage.
Jerkowski says the most damage from the tornado occurred between the Snow Ridge Ski Resort and the West Wind Motel in Turin. At the resort, many trees are down and there's extensive damage to buildings. According to the resort's Facebook page, all 3 chairlifts were damaged in the storm, and a tree was put through the cab window of the snow grooming machine. No injuries have been reported from the storm. Catherine Wheeler, North Country Public Radio.
So the Environmental Bond Act, $4 billion to spend on climate mitigation and environmental projects. And the state is now asking New Yorkers how to spend that money. A big chance in the North Country is tomorrow's listening session at the Town Hall in downtown Saranac Lake from 11 to 1. Our Adirondack reporter Emily Russell spoke with DEC Commissioner Basil Sagos about the Bond Act and what it could mean for the Adirondack North Country.
The Environmental Bond Act is really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make the state more resilient in the face of a changing world, right? Changing climate in particular. And the Adirondacks is unfortunately no stranger to the idea of severe weather. We canceled the last Bond Act listening session in Saranac Lake because it was literally scheduled for the week of those terrible storms that went through Long Lake and Newcomb and did incredible damage to the built and natural environment. So when you look at a Bond Act like this, $4.2 billion, a statewide Bond Act that has as its intent to reduce flood damage, to mitigate the impacts of climate change, to protect our landscape, to protect our water supplies. This is a transformational moment for us as a state.
Yeah, what are some specific projects in the Adirondack North Country that you envision getting funded by the Environmental Bond Act?
Well, look, and you just take the recent example of flooding in Long Lake. It was a simple culvert on a small creek, feeding into Long Lake that couldn't take the flows of that intense weather. And as a result, the water overtopped the culvert, washed out the roadway, and really seriously impacted the surrounding buildings. A Bond Act investment in that case would be a wider culvert, right? That acknowledges that we're now seeing more intense rain, more intense precipitation. And that's a very minor investment in really a very important outcome, the outcome being the sustainability of Long Lake as a tourism destination or as a hamlet where people can live. There are other really important investments to make, of course, setting aside land, buying land for the purpose of water preservation and habitat preservation, farmland protection. Farms are a backbone of our upstate economy, right? Being able to set aside farmland or create buffers around farms as well, super important to keep those farms vibrant for many years to come.
I've heard from environmental groups and local officials that, sometimes grant money from the state can be complicated to apply for and then to use. What would you say to folks who think, there might be just too many hoops to jump through to get funding from the Bond Act?
Well, we're always looking to make these really important pots of money more accessible to municipalities across the state. I mean, it is an enormous amount of money, and we need to make sure we spend it the right way. So we've spent quite a bit of time over the last few months to begin drafting the criteria for eligibility. So what projects would be eligible? Obviously, not everything is bondable, right? You can't bond overnight stay at a hotel. You need to be able to bond something that will physically last for 10 years or more. So it is really important to put guidelines around those dollars so that we're spending those public dollars wisely. And ultimately, getting the projects, getting the funding pots out onto the street as quickly as possible, having quick turnaround times for review of those projects, and then ultimately helping municipalities meet their objectives through the creation of these projects. I mean, all of these things are going to be happening at the same time. And I think there's some lessons learned from the last Bond Act for sure, where it took quite a bit of time to spend some of the money. There are even some dollars left over from the last Bond Act. So I anticipate that this money, this Bond Act, will be spent aggressively, certainly over the next 5 years, to put those dollars into communities all across the state.
So the last Bond Act passed by New Yorkers preserved more than 150,000 acres in the Adirondacks. This one sets aside $650 million for land preservation. How would you or other state officials like to see that money used in the Adirondacks? Are there any kind of dream preservation projects in the park?
Well, I'm sure everyone has a plot of land that they'd like to set aside. I mean, we certainly have done enormous work over the last, we'll call it 50 years, setting aside land in the Adirondacks. We want to leave some of the ambition to the public. We want to hear those ideas. That's why we do listening sessions, so that we're not just talking to the public about the Bond Act, but ultimately hearing from the public about where they want those dollars spent. And yes, you're right. Land acquisition will be a huge focus of this. It will be an untraditional focus in some ways, right? We want to emphasize smaller plots of land in urban areas, for example, where you have communities without access to green space or parks. That would be one end of the Bond Act. The other end of the Bond Act might be the acquisition of larger pieces of land, whether it's the Adirondacks or Catskills or Western New York.
I wonder if you could just kind of paint a picture of New York State, 10 or 20 years from now. How do you think this $4.2 billion Environmental Bond Act could change the landscape of the state?
I certainly see a greener state, a more resilient state, a state that can better withstand the changing climate. We, of course, felt it with Superstorm Sandy down in New York City, Long Island, back in 2012. And it feels like every year we're seeing more and more of these impacts. I'm hoping that with this investment, we can turn the tide and better position the state to withstand what is to come, which is unfortunately more severe weather. So when you see a community get cut off, as many have been through these storms, how quickly can it get back on its feet? And ultimately, what does that mean for its sustainability, its economy? It means everything. When you have Long Lake and Newcomb shut down for a week or two, I mean, that's life and death. It really is. And it really means everything when it comes to the sustainability of a place like the Adirondacks from the hamlet's perspective. So I'm hoping that this potential investment will excite the public, give them a sense of what's possible in the years to come, start not identifying pet projects, but identifying projects that will really have an impact on the future of the state. And we're there to work directly with the communities for the years to come.
That was DEC Commissioner Basil Sagos speaking with Emily Russell. Sagos and other state officials will be hosting a Bond Act listening session tomorrow from 11 to 1 at the Town Hall Auditorium in downtown Saranac Lake. You can also submit written comments to the DEC. We have more news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by the Currys of Potsdam and Paul Myers of Colton. I'm David Summerstein, North Country Public Radio.